Chapter 17 of the Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guide for those who travel in the wilderness. The Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness, by Horace Kephart. Chapter 17 Edible Plants of the Wilderness. There is a popular notion that our Indians in olden times varied their meat diet with nothing but wild roots and herbs. This, in fact, was the case only among those tribes that pursued a roving life and had no settled abodes, such as the horse Indians and diggers of the far west, and not all of them. The forest Indians east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes, particularly such nations as the Iroquois and Cherokees, lived in villages, and cultivated corn, beans, squashes, and pumpkins. Still, wild plants and roots were often used even by these semi-agricultural peoples, in the same way that garden vegetables are used by us, and, in time of famine or invasion, they were sometimes almost the sole means of sustenance. Today, although our wild lands, such as are left, produce all the native plants that were known to the red men, there is probably not one white hunter or forester in 1,000 who can pick out the edible plants of the wilderness, nor who would know how to cook them if such were given to him. Nor are many of our botanists better informed. Now, it is quite as important in many cases to know how to cook a wild plant as it is to be able to find it, for otherwise one might make as serious a mistake as if he ate the vine of a potato instead of its tuber, or a tomato vine instead of the fruit. Take for example the cassava or manioc, which is still the staple food of most of the inhabitants of tropical America, and is largely used elsewhere. The root of the bitter manioc, which is used with the same impunity as other species, contains a milky sap that is charged with prussic acid, and is one of the most virulent vegetable poisons known to science. The Indians somehow discovered that this sap is volatile and can be driven off by heat. The root is cleaned, sliced, dried on hot metal plates or stones, grated, powdered, the starch separated from the meal, and the result is the tapioca of commerce, or farina, or Brazilian arrowroot, as may be, which we ourselves eat and feed to our children and invalids, not knowing perchance that if it had not been for the art of a red savage, the stuff taken into our stomachs would have caused almost instant death. Another example, not of a poisonous, but of an extremely acrid root that the Indians used for bread, and which really is of delicious flavour when rightly prepared, is the common Indian turnip. Every country schoolboy thinks he knows all about this innocent-looking bulb. He remembers when some older boy grudgingly allowed him the tiniest nibble of this sacred vegetable, and how he, the recipient of the favour, started to say, "'Tain't bad," and then concluded his remark with what we good grown-up people utter when we jab the black ink pen into the red ink bottle. However, not all of our wild food plants are acrid or poisonous in a raw state, nor is it dangerous for any one with a rudimentary knowledge of botany to experiment with them. Many are easily identified by those who know nothing at all of botany. I cannot say that all of them are palatable, but most of them are when properly prepared for the table. Their taste in a raw state, generally speaking, is no more of a criterion than is that of raw beans or asparagus. To give a detailed account of the edible wild plants of the United States and Canada, with descriptions and illustrations sufficing to identify them, would require by itself a book at least as large as this. I have only space to give the names and edible properties of those that I know of which are native to, or as wild plants have become naturalized in the region north of the southern boundary of Virginia and east of the Rocky Mountains. Besides those mentioned below, there are others which grow only in the southern or western states, among the more important being the palmetto, palm, yam, cacti, aloe, Spanish bayonet, mesquite, wild sago, orchunti, tool plant, western camas, coos root, breadroot, screw bean, pimple mallow, manzanita, piñons, juniper nuts, many pine seeds, squawberry, lycium berry, but the list is long enough. Those who wish further details should examine the publications of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and especially those of one of its officers, Mr. F.V. Coville, who has made special studies in this subject. I have given the botanical name of every plant cited herein, because without it there would be no guarantee of identification. The nomenclature adopted is that of Britton and Brown in their Illustrated Flora of the Northern States and Canada (Scribner's Sons, New York), which, as it contains an illustration of every plant, is of the first assistance to an amateur in identifying. Wherever Gray's nomenclature differs, it is added in parentheses. The months named under each plant are those in which it flowers, the earlier month in each case being the flowering month in the plant's southernmost range, and the later one that of the northernmost. In the case of wild fruits, the months are those in which the fruit ripens. It is necessary to remember that most of the edible plants become tough and bitter when they have reached full bloom. Substantial foods. Acorns. The eastern oaks that yield sweet mast are the basket, blackjack, bur, chestnut, overcup, post, rock chestnut, scrub chestnut, swamp white, and white oaks, the acorns of chestnut and post oaks being the sweetest. Those producing bitter mast are the black, pin, red, scarlet, shingle, Spanish, water, and willow oaks, of which the black and water oak acorns are most astringent. None of these can be used raw as human food, without more or less ill effect from the tannin contained; but there are tribes of western Indians who extract the tannin from even the most astringent acorns and make bread out of their flour. The process varies somewhat among different tribes, but essentially it is as follows. The acorns are collected when ripe, spread out to dry in the sun, cracked, and stored until the kernels are dry, care being taken that they do not mold. The kernels are then pulverized in a mortar to a fine meal, with frequent siftings to remove the coarser particles, until the whole is ground to a fine flour, this being essential. The tannin is then dissolved out by placing the flour in a filter and letting water percolate through it for about 2 hours, or until the water ceases to have a yellowish tinge. One form of filter is contrived by laying a coarse, flat basket or strainer on a pile of gravel with a drain underneath. Rather fine gravel is now scattered thickly over the bottom and up the sides of the strainer, and the meal laid thickly over the gravel. Water is added little by little to set free the tannin. The meal is removed by hand as much as possible, then water is poured over the remainder to get it together, and thus little is wasted. The meal by this time has the consistency of ordinary dough. The dough is cooked in 2 ways. First, by boiling it in water as we do cornmeal mush, the resulting porridge being not unlike yellow cornmeal mush in appearance and taste. It is sweet and wholesome, but rather insipid. The second mode is to make the dough into small balls, which are wrapped in green corn leaves. These balls are then placed in hot ashes, some green leaves or corn are laid over them, and hot ashes are placed on the top, and the cakes are thus baked. Acorns possess remarkable fattening power, and their nutritive value, when the tannin has been removed, is high. Coville, Contributions to the U.S. Herbarium, 7, No. 3. Palmer, in American Naturalist, 12, 597. Another method used by the Pomo Indians, who add 5% of red earth to the dough, is described by J.W. Hudson in the American Anthropologist (1900, pages 775-6). Nuts. Among the Cherokees, and also in Italy and in the Austrian Tyrol, I have eaten bread made from chestnuts. The Cherokee method, when they have corn also, is to use the chestnuts whole, mixing them with enough cornmeal dough to hold them together, and then baking cakes of this material enclosed in corn husks, like tamales. The peasants of southern Europe make bread from the meal of chestnuts alone, the large European chestnut, of course, being used. Such bread is palatable and nutritious, but lies heavily on one's stomach until he becomes accustomed to it. Our Indians also have made bread from the kernels of buckeyes. These in a raw state are poisonous, but when dried, powdered, and freed from their poison by filtration, like acorns, they yield an edible and nutritious flour. The method is to first roast the nuts, then hull and peel them, mash them in a basket with a billet, and then leach them. The resulting paste may be baked or eaten cold. Hazelnuts, beechnuts, pecans, and wankapins may be used like chestnuts. The oil expressed from beechnuts is little inferior to the best olive oil for table use, and will keep sweet for 10 years. The oil from butternuts and black walnuts used to be highly esteemed by the eastern Indians, either to mix with their food or as a frying fat. They pounded the ripe kernels, boiled them in water, and skimmed off the oil, using the remaining paste as bread. Hickory nut oil was easily obtained by crushing the whole nuts, precipitating the broken shells in water, and skimming off the oily milk, which was used as we use cream or butter. The nut of the ironwood (blue beech) is edible. The kernel of the long-leaved pine cone is edible and of an agreeable taste. Many western pines have edible nuts. The acridity of pine seeds can be removed by roasting. All nuts are more digestible when roasted than when eaten raw. Arrowhead, broad-leaved. Swan or swamp potato, Sagittaria latifolia (Sagittaria variabilis). In shallow water, ditches. Throughout North America, except extreme north, to Mexico, July to September. Tuberous roots as large as hens' eggs were an important article of food among Indians. Roots bitter when raw, but rendered sweet and palatable by boiling. Excellent when cooked with meat. Indians gather them by wading and loosening roots with their feet when the tubers float up and are gathered. Leaves acrid. Arum, green arrow. Peltandra virginica (Peltandra undulata), Arum virginicum. Swamps or shallow water. Maine and Ontario to Michigan, south to Florida and Louisiana, May to June. Rootstock used by eastern Indians for food, under the name of tahoe. Roots very large, acrid when fresh. The method of cooking this root, and that of the golden club, is thus described by Captain John Smith in his History of Virginia, 1624, page 87. The chief root they have for food is called tockawoff. It groweth like a flag in marshes. In one day a savage will gather sufficient for a week. These roots are much of the greatness and taste of potatoes. They used to cover a great many of them with oak leaves and fern, and then cover all with earth in the manner of a coal pit (charcoal pit). Over it, on each side, they continue a great fire 24 hours before they dare eat it. Raw it is no better than poison, and being roasted, except it be tender and the heat abated, or sliced and dried in the sun, mixed with sorrel and meal or such like, it will prickle and torment the throat extremely, and yet in summer they use this ordinarily for bread." Arum, water. Wild calla (Palustris). Cold bogs. Nova Scotia to Minnesota, south to Virginia, Wisconsin, Iowa, May to June. Mizen bread is made in Lapland from the roots of this plant, which are acrid when raw. They are taken up in spring when the leaves come forth, are extremely well washed, and then dried. The fibrous parts are removed, and the remainder dried in an oven. This is then bruised and chopped into pieces as small as peas or oatmeal, and then ground. The meal is boiled slowly, and continually stirred like mush. It is then left standing for 3 or 4 days, when the acridity disappears. (Lancaster). Broom rape, Louisiana. Orobanche ludoviciana (Aphelon L.). Sandy soil. Illinois to northwestern Tennessee, south to Texas, Arizona, California, June to August. "All the plant except the bloom grows under the ground, and consequently nearly all is very white and succulent. Pi Utes consume great numbers of them in summer. Being succulent, they answer for food and drink on these sandy plains, and indeed are often called sand food." (Palmer). Bulrush, great. Matrush, tool root. Scirpus lacustris. Ponds and swamps throughout North America, also in Old World, June to September. Roots resemble artichokes, but are much larger. Eaten raw, they prevent thirst and afford nourishment. Flour made from the dried root is white, sweet, and very nutritious. A great favorite with the Western Indians, who pound the roots and make bread of them. When the fresh roots are bruised, mixed with water and boiled, they afford a good syrup. Camas, Eastern, wild hyacinth. Qualmasi hyacinthia (Camassi fraseri). In meadows and along streams, Pennsylvania to Minnesota, south to Alabama and Texas, April to May. Root is very nutritious and with an agreeable mucilaginous taste. Golden club, Orontium aquaticum. Swamps and ponds, Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, south to Florida and Louisiana, mostly near coast, April to May. The taw key of coast Indians, who liked the dried seeds when cooked like peas. The raw root is acrid, but becomes edible when cooked like arrow arum. Grass, drop seed, sand drop seed, Sporobolus cryptandrus. Also barnyard or cockspur grass (Panicum cruscali). When the seeds, which are gathered in great quantities by Western Indians, are parched, ground, mixed with water or milk, and baked into bread, or made into mush, they are of good flavor and nutritious. Also eaten dry. Grass, Panicum, several species. The ripe seeds are collected, like the above, cleaned by winnowing, ground into flour, water added, and the masses kneaded into hard cakes, which, when dried in the sun, are ready for use. Also made into gruel and mush. Grass, floating manna, Panicularia flutans (Glyceria fl.). The seeds are of agreeable flavor and highly nutritious material for soups and gruels. Greenbrier, bristly, stretchberry, Smilax bononox. Massachusetts and Kansas, south to Florida and Texas, April to July. The large tuberous rootstocks are said to have been used by the Indians, who ground them into meal and made bread or gruel of it. In the South, a drink is made from them. Greenbrier, long stalked, Smilax pseudochina. Dry or sand thickets, Maryland to Nebraska, south to Florida and Texas, March to August. Bartram says that the Florida Indians prepared from this plant "a very agreeable cooling sort of jelly, which they call conte (not to be confounded with the coontie or wild sago). This is prepared from the root of the China brier (Smilax pseudochina). They chop the roots in pieces, which are afterwards well pounded in a wooden mortar. Then, being mixed with clean water in a tray or trough, they strain it through baskets. The sediment, which settles to the bottom of the second vessel, is afterwards dried in the open air, and is then a very fine reddish flour or meal. A small quantity of this, mixed with warm water and sweetened with honey, when cool, becomes a beautiful, delicious jelly, very nourishing and wholesome. They also mix it with fine corn flour, which, being fried in fresh bear's oil, makes very good hot cakes or fritters." Groundnut, wild bean, Indian potato, Apios apios (A. tuberosa). Moist ground, New Brunswick to Florida, west to Minnesota and Kansas, south to Louisiana, July to September. This is the famous hopness of New Jersey Indians, the sagaban of the Micmacs, opanok of the Virginia tribes, scherzo of the Carolinas, tox of the Osages, and modo of the Sioux, under one or other of which names it is frequently met by students of our early annals. "In 1654, the town laws of Southampton, Massachusetts, obtained that if an Indian dug ground nuts on land occupied by the English, he was to be set in the stocks, and for a second offence to be whipped." The Pilgrims, during their first winter, lived on these roots. The tubers vary from the size of cherries to that of a hen's egg, or larger. They grow in strings of perhaps 40 together, resembling common potatoes in shape, taste, and odor. When boiled, they are quite palatable and wholesome. The seeds in the pod can be prepared like common peas. Indian turnip, Jack in the pulpit, Erycema triphyllum (Arum triphyllum). Moist woods and thickets, Nova Scotia to Florida, west to Minnesota, Kansas, Louisiana. April to June. Fruit ripe, June to July. The root of this plant is so acrid when raw that if one but touch the tip of his tongue to it, in a few seconds that unlucky member will sting as if touched to a nettle. Yet it was a favourite bread root of the Indians. I have found bulbs as much as 11 inches in circumference and weighing half a pound. Some writers state that the acridity of the root is destroyed by boiling, while others recommend baking. Neither alone will do. The bulb may be boiled for 2 hours, or baked as long, and, while the outer portion will have a characteristically pleasant flavour, half potato, half chestnut, the inner part will still be as uneatable as a spoonful of red pepper. The root should either be roasted or boiled, then peeled, dried, and pounded in a mortar, or otherwise reduced to flour. Then, if it is heated again, or let stand for a day or two, it becomes bland and wholesome, having been reduced to a starchy substance resembling arrowroot. Even if the fresh root is only grated finely and let stand exposed to air until it is thoroughly dry, the acridity will have evaporated with the juice. The roots may be preserved for a year by storing in damp sand. It is said that the Indians also cooked and ate the berries. Lily, Turk's cap, Lilium superbum. Meadows and marshes, Maine to Minnesota, south to North Carolina and Tennessee, July to August. Lily, wild, yellow, Canada lily, Lilium canadense. Swamps, meadows, and fields, Nova Scotia to Minnesota, south to Georgia, Alabama, and Missouri, June to July. Both of these lilies have fleshy, edible bulbs. When green, they look and taste somewhat like raw green corn on the ear. The Indians use them instead of flour to thicken stews, etc. (Thoreau). Lily, yellow pond, Spatterdock, Nymphea advena (Nuphar advena). Ponds and slow streams, Nova Scotia to Rocky Mountains, south to Florida, Texas, Utah. April to September. The roots, which are 1 or 2 feet long, grow 4 or 5 feet under water, and Indian women dive for them. They are very porous, slightly sweet, and glutinous, generally boiled with wild flour, but often roasted separately. Muskrats store large quantities for winter use, and their houses are frequently robbed by the Indians. The pulverized seeds of the plant are made into bread or gruel, or parched and eaten like popcorn. Nelumbo, American. Wankapin or Yonkopin. Water, Chinquapin. Nelumbo lutea. Ponds and swamps. Locally, east from Ontario to Florida. Abundant west to Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, Louisiana. July to August. Tubers of root somewhat resemble sweet potatoes, and are little inferior to them when well boiled. A highly prized food of the Indians. The green and succulent half-ripe seed pods are delicate and nutritious. From the sweet, mealy seeds, which resemble hazelnuts, the Indians made bread, soups, etc. The nuts were first steeped in water, and then parched in sand to easily extricate the kernels. These were mixed with fat and made into a palatable soup, or were ground into flour and baked. Frequently they were parched without steeping, and the kernels eaten thus. Orchis, showy. Orchis spectabilis. Rich woods. New Brunswick to Minnesota, south to Georgia, Kentucky, Nebraska. April to June. Quote, one of the orchids that springs from a tuberous root, and as such finds favour with the country people of the South in the preparation of a highly nourishing food for children. Lounsbury. Peanut, hog, wild peanut. Falcata camosa. Glycine comosa), moist thickets, New Brunswick to Florida, west to Lake Superior, Nebraska, Louisiana, August to September. The underground pod has been cultivated as a vegetable. (Porcher), potato, prairie turnip, Indian or Missouri breadroot, the pomme blanche of the voyageurs, Sorrelia esculenta. Prairies, Manitoba and North Dakota to Texas, June. The farinaceous tuber, generally the size of a hen's egg, has a thick, leathery envelope, easily separable from the smooth internal parts, which become friable when dry, and are readily pulverized, affording a light, starchy flour, with sweetish, turnip-like taste. Often sliced and dried by the Indians for winter use. Palatable in any form. Rice, wild, Zizania aquatica, swamps, New Brunswick to Manitoba, south to Florida, Louisiana, Texas, June to October. The chief farinaceous food of probably 30,000 of our northern Indians, and now on the market as a breakfast food. The harvesting is usually done by 2 persons working together, one propelling the canoe, and the one in the stern gently pulling the plants over the canoe and beating off the ripe seeds with 2 sticks. The seed, when gathered, is spread out for a few hours to dry, and is then parched in a kettle over a slow fire for half an hour to an hour, meanwhile being evenly and constantly stirred. It is then spread out to cool. After this it is hulled by putting about a bushel of the seed into a hole in the ground, lined with staves or burnt clay, and beating or punching it with heavy sticks. The grains and hulls are separated by tossing the mixture into the wind from baskets. The grain will keep indefinitely. Before cooking, it should have several washings in cold water to remove the smoky taste. It is cooked with game or as gruel, or made into bread, or merely eaten dry. Its food value is equal to that of our common cereals. "An acre of rice is nearly or quite equal to an acre of wheat in nutriment." For details, see Bulletin No. 50 of the Bureau of Plant Industry, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Silverweed, wild or goose tansy, goosegrass, potentilla and serena. Shores and salt meadows, marshes and river banks. Greenland to New Jersey, west to Nebraska, Alaska, south along the Rocky Mountains to New Mexico and California, May to September. Roots gathered in spring and eaten either raw or roasted. Starchy and wholesome. When roasted or boiled, their taste resembles chestnuts. Sunflower, Helianthus, many species. Prairies, etc., July to September. "The seeds of these plants form one of the staple articles of food for many Indians, and they gather them in great quantities. The agreeable oily nature of the seeds renders them very palatable. When parched and ground, they are highly prized, and are eaten on hunting excursions. The meal or flour is also made into thin cakes and baked in hot ashes. These cakes are of a grey color, rather coarse looking, but palatable and very nutritious. Having eaten of the bread made from sunflowers, I must say that it is as good as much of the corn bread eaten by whites." (Palmer). The oil expressed from sunflower seeds is a good substitute for olive oil. Valerian, edible, tobacco root, Valeriana edulis. Wet, open places, Ontario to British Columbia, south to Ohio, Wisconsin, and in Rocky Mountains to New Mexico and Arizona, May to August. "I ate here for the first time kuya, or tobacco root (Valeriana edulis), the principal edible root among the Indians who inhabit the upper waters of the streams on the western side of the Rocky Mountains. It has a very strong and remarkably peculiar taste and odor, which I can compare to no other vegetable that I am acquainted with, and which to some persons is extremely offensive. To others, however, the taste is rather an agreeable one, and I was afterwards always glad when it formed an addition to our scanty meals. It is full of nutriment. In its unprepared state, it is said by the Indians to have very strong poisonous qualities, of which it is deprived by a peculiar process, being baked in the ground for about 2 days." (Fremont, Exploring Expedition, 1845, page 135.) End of Chapter 17. Part I.